8 years after China annexed Tibet, the 14th Dalai Lama fled to India, where he set up Tibet's government in exile in 1959. 5 decades later, he ceded his political role to Lobsang Sangai, who was elected the first president of the Central Tibetan Administration. Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. Today, we're speaking exclusively with our special guest, Lobsang Sangai, former Central Tibetan Administration president, also Harvard Law School East Asian Legal Studies Program Senior Visiting Fellow. Dr. Sangai was born in Darjeeling, India, and has a doctoral degree in legal studies from Harvard University. And Wenqi Yu, Harvard Kennedy School Fellow. Welcome you to the show today, both of you.
Thank you.
Sikyung, let me start with you first. So you took the political reins over from the 14th Dalai Lama. Can you give us a sense of how it felt to be filling the shoes of the man, the single man who is capable of uniting and mobilizing Tibetans both inside China and outside?
And also a global figure. You know, he's revered around the world by Buddhists and internationally recognized as a Nobel Peace Laureate. So it was an impossible task, to fill in the shoes of His Holiness Dalai Lama. And he decided to devolve all his political authority right after I got elected, So it was a major undertaking. But for 10 years, I did the best I could. And, so I hope Tibetan people will remind me that, he did his best.
And can you tell us, over those 10 years, what were your goals and did they change?
Essentially, preserve your identity and then pursue your dignity, or freedom around the world. So on the one hand, we have cultural, educational projects to educate our children, maintain our identity, and then travel around the world, lobby different parliaments and different governments to seek support for Tibet. For example, you lobby US Congress and pass Tibetan Policy and Support Act of 2020, which is a law in America to support Tibet. So a lot of traveling, a lot of lobbying, at the same time keeping the faith or the aspirations and solidarity of Tibetan people inside and outside strong. Perhaps one of the most difficult job, I would say.
Yes, and no easy task. Because, of course, when you were president from 2011 to 2021 for 2 terms, that was also the period of Xi Jinping's emergence as China's leader. Can you tell us about how his policy towards Tibet changed over your 2 terms?
Each time there was a change in the leadership in China, Tibetans are always optimistic and hopeful people. We hope that Xi Jinping's father, Xi Tongshun, was close to late Panchen Lama. He knew about Tibet, and there's some rumor that perhaps his wife or mother was Buddhist. So there was some hopeful indications from our side. But then in that 10 years period, situation in Tibet became from bad to worse. For example, every year Freedom House comes out with a report and listed Tibet as one of the least free regions comparable to Syria or North Korea. So it became, it was very bad and it became worse, so unfortunately.
Once you want to bring you in, can you help us to compare Taiwan's situation? Obviously, for Taiwan, the CCP says that Taiwan has always been part of China, although, of course, Taiwan says that it has never been part of the PRC. It's also under threat from China's annexation. So what sort of parallels or differences would you draw?
Yeah. I'll start with the difference. We know that the Republic of China was created in 1911, right? And the PRC was created in 1949. So it is undeniable that legally speaking, ROC is separate and different from PRC. Now, the government that's representing ROC is now in Taiwan. The capital is Taipei. So there are definitely legal arguments for how ROC is represented in Taiwan is different and separate from PRC. Now, For China to say that, Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, Macau, or Hong Kong, sort of lumping them all together, actually suits their argument that they're all part of China and PRC. So that's number one. I always hesitate to sort of draw the parallel to say they're all similar. Of course, they're similar in the sense that it's under the framework of Beijing that they're all part of China, and therefore, lumping them all together treats them as sort of Beijing, is the capital and leads all these regions or however territories.
If I may add, the way I look at it is, China, where the Han Chinese used to live for thousands of years, okay, is essentially below the Great Wall, and that's where 90% Han Chinese live even today. So up north, Mongolians, Manchus were all barbarians and foreigners, and towards the west, Xinjiang, Uyghur people, Tibetans were all barbarians and foreigners, right? So they expanded all the way up north and to the west. So Great Wall was the border of China for thousands of years.
Right.
Many emperors spent time building and rebuilding, reconstructing Great Wall. Now they have gone beyond that, and then they say, this is China now. But actually the proper China where Han Chinese live is only 40% of the area, right? So now they are moving down south, and by saying Taiwan is also part of China, and East China Sea, South China Sea is part of the same expansionist design of China.
Absolutely. And
so that's what happened to Tibet. I always, now I'm here in Taiwan, I always say what happened to Tibet could happen to Taiwan next, so be careful.
Right, but because for centuries the Han Chinese also viewed Taiwan as an undesirable place full of barbarians.
That's it, yes.
Right. Okay, so let's...
We all are barbarians. We are not part of the Tungo, the Middle Kingdom, yes.
Let's go back to 2005, the year in which the 14th Dalai Lama rejected Tibetan independence. And he said, I quote, "I'm not in favor of separation. Tibet is a part of the People's Republic of China. It is an autonomous region of the PRC. Tibetan culture and Buddhism are part of Chinese culture." So given what you have just told me, do you believe that that Tibet is part of the PRC, that Tibetan culture is part of China's?
I think perhaps this news, the quote in the newspaper, perhaps there was a bit of misquotation, because His Holiness Dalai Lama always said that middle way policy means to be in the middle, where the Chinese government has to end repression of the Tibetan people. Then we will not seek separation, provided we are given genuine autonomy.
So there is a condition.
It's conditional. First, end repression, give genuine autonomy, then we'll not seek separation, right? So historically, Tibet was an independent country, always. If you go back to 8th century, there was a treaty between China and Tibet, which said Tibetans will be happy in the great land of Tibet, Chinese will be happy in the great land of China, signed by representative of the Chinese emperor and Tibetan king, right? That still exists in the form of stone pillar, So throughout, Tibet has always been an independent country. So, but Tibet was occupied, brutally occupied. Destruction of, 98% of monasteries and nunneries, 99.9% monks and nuns were disrobed. Even today, there's repression, the major surveillance system, right? For example, 99% of Tibetans are denied passport. The passport that were issued was seized by the Chinese government. So they're so scared that Tibetans might travel outside and speak the truth or the reality that's happening inside Tibet, that they want to hide and, essentially shut down the whole Tibetan region.
And that brings me, Wenqi, to maybe we can do some comparisons with Xinjiang. Any differences in the way perhaps the world understands Tibet on one side and Xinjiang on the other?
Yeah, I think for a while, I think the issue and the attention paid to Tibet, whether it's through politicians or celebrities, did help the world understand what is really going on in Tibet. And later on, obviously, we saw more of the repression that's taking place in Xinjiang and happening to the Uyghur people. I don't, pretend to know, and I'm definitely not an expert in either part. And unfortunately, I think how, what China has been doing is, again, to frame some of the activities because of the repression, that resistance as terrorist attack. And so especially, I would say, for the Uyghurs, that became a very convenient excuse for them, especially after 9/11, that what we're seeing is there's this, global fear of terrorists, and a lot of them associate them with Islamists. And so we know that Uyghurs are also, believe in that Islam. And so I think, in terms of cracking down, and it just became even more convenient for the Beijing government to label them as terrorists, and so to galvanize support for their repression.
So let's cross back to Tibet, because obviously Tibet doesn't have terrorists. Tibetans practice, and Dalai Lama has always promoted non-violence. So what's the narrative there? How does it, for you, Sikyong, differ? Because there is, of course, the overarching narrative from China, which is, stabilize Tibet, stabilize Xinjiang, save them, liberate them, and then bring economic prosperity.
That's a classic colonial argument, Oh, they were feudal, they were backward, they were so poor, we made them rich, we have civilized them, so the colonies should be grateful to the colonizer, that has always, and particularly if you read Chinese history, their high school textbook, this is how they explain, 100 years of humiliation, you see. So they're doing exactly the same thing, but now victim has become victimizer. But then Tibetans, as victims, were not supposed to complain. Now, as Wenchu said about Xinjiang or Uyghur region as well, it's important to know that Tibet was one of the major issues internationally in 1980s and 1990s. In recent years now, the genocide in Uyghur region, Inner Mongolia, and again the crackdown on Hong Kong, right? So when it happened, I always say this is good in the sense, before when Tibet was the only prominent issue internationally, they used to say, oh, it's an exception, Tibetan's an exception. Now there's a pattern, Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, Hong Kongers, and then increasingly, pressure and intimidation on Taiwan clearly show that we are dealing with the regime. We are dealing with a systematic strategy on the part of Beijing to, expand its region. So, I've met many people who said, oh, China is a very peaceful country. They have not done anything violent for the last 300 years. But I said, no, look at Tibet, look at Hong Kong, look at Xinjiang, and hopefully, I hope not, but, increasing threat towards Hong Kong. So we are dealing with the regime.
Can I bring you now to Mao Zedong's strategy, which is the 5 fingers and palm strategy? So this was, announced in 1939. Obviously, Tibet was annexed in 1950, 1951. So the idea was that following the annexation of Tibet, then there would be 5 fingers that would come in later stages: Ladakh, Nepal, Sikkim, Bhutan, and Arunachal Pradesh. How much of Mao's strategy do you see Xi Jinping continuing?
I'm glad you brought this up because, this code was there for a long time. And when the Doklam, incident happened,
2017,
17 between India and from Chinese side, and then in 2020 in Galwan Valley in Ladakh, right?
Yeah.
So I appeared in major TV and news media, so I made it quite, well known. So Mao Zedong has said since, for ages saying, Tibet is the palm, we must occupy it, then go after 5 fingers. So Galwan Valley is in Ladakh. Doklam, borders Bhutan and Sikkim, and the chicken neck of India. And then there's always conflicts and tension in Arunachal Pradesh. So, and then recently, New York Times in August came out with this, huge expose of more than 300 border villages are being built all the way from Karakoram, from Tibet all the way to Myanmar, right? So the intrusion into, all the neighboring countries of Nepal, Bhutan, and India, it's happening. So what Mao Zedong said is being implemented now.
Right, and but it's not through fighting. It's not through kinetic war or violence. Now, I mean, Tibet was, but these appear not to be. So this kind of winning without a fight strategy, how do we explain that change? Can you explain the shift that's occurred?
Well, there's definitely security forces stabilizing in those regions, even though it's not technically defined as fighting, right? Skirmishes on the borders with India and crackdown.
Not non-firearms, though.
Right, right. One thing that's really interesting about the way Beijing approaches those territories is that the economic prosperity that they try to introduce to the region as a way to integrate the locals and the Han people or the Chinese culture. We've seen that being played out everywhere. And so from Tibet to Xinjiang and even Hong Kong today, and what Beijing tried with Taiwan, right? Increasing economic and trade relationship, but that's always been the approach. And if I'm not wrong, I think one of the most senior officials,
the party secretary of Tibet, yes.
Right, party secretary. So, I mean, essentially they're replicating what they're doing in those areas. And what we're seeing in Hong Kong these days, especially like if you go to Hong Kong today, the language spoken there rather than Cantonese is more Chinese, and in their education system, right, introducing and ensuring the Chinese identity is there. I mean, these are years of campaign and very thought out plan to make sure that the identity of China is instilled in every one of them. So, and of course, economic prosperity is something that they know is very powerful. And they use that around the world as well, right? Economic power and leverage that they've had. So this is, something very strategic and very thoughtful, and they have a lot of patience to do that.
Acting around the world, I always say this, if you want to understand China, you must understand Tibet. If you don't understand Tibet, you will never understand China. Because the blueprint of the United Front approaches, co-optation, intimidation, all that took place in Tibet, and it's taking place around the world, So that's why, what's happening in Hong Kong, first they send United Front, right? So that's why winning without fighting. And I'm sure it's happening in Taiwan as well, and it's happening around the world. So one should be very careful. Because I was giving a talk somewhere in South India, and there were 2 African students, they raised their hands and asked me a question. Before they asked me a question, I said, oh, so are they building good roads, and are they building good entertainment center, and are they, are they friendly with your leaders? I said, how do you know about my country? I said, that happened to Tibet. 60 years ago, I can tell you, this is exact same blueprint, So co-optation or buying off of politicians, business people, news media, and intellectuals. This is a classic strategy. It goes all the way back 2,000-3,000 years when China first, started building up. So one should be very, very careful.
All right. And it also seems to fit with that sort of hiding your capabilities, biding your time. You mentioned India. I just very quickly wanted to ask your opinion. How would you characterize India's support for Tibet? Obviously it has fluctuated depending on India's relations with China. So now, how would you define it?
Now, by and large, India has been the biggest supporter for Tibet because His Holiness Dalai Lama has continued to live in India, and Tibetan government exile is there. So, of course, there has been many political parties that have changed power, But by and large, Tibetans could do what we want and function the way we want to. So India has been the biggest supporter of Tibet. Having said that, whenever some dignitaries from China comes to India, and then we Tibetans go out and protest, right? So obviously we get some what they call lathi charge and some bamboo sticks from Indian policemen and go to police station from time to time. Other than that, by and large, India has been the biggest supporter of Tibet.
Let's move now to the US's stance on Tibet. There were two significant acts from 2020 and 2024. The latest one during, obviously, Joe Biden's administration, where they stress that they also see Tibet as part of the PRC, but they urge direct dialogue between China and the Dalai Lama. In 2020, this was about the succession of the Dalai Lama, and that this was a purely spiritual issue, and it should not be chosen by the PRC. If Chinese officials attempt to do that, they would be sanctioned. How much impact does the US, in terms of these acts, have on the future of Tibet?
Like Taiwan, Tibetan government exile, also we have to function in gray area. Right? For example, I was never allowed to enter the State Department White House for 10 years of my term because I was the head of the government exile. Right? But then just before we passed that law in 2020, I entered the State Department, right? And after we passed that law, I made sure that my office, the Sikyong and Tibetan government exile, is acknowledged in that law. Now my successor can enter the State Department, without being prevented by any agencies in the State Department. Yes, and in the 2020, that the funding for Tibetans is being now, itemized in the budget. And as far as succession is concerned, law makes it very clear that it is for His Holiness Dalai Lama to decide and no one else, especially not the Chinese government. Now look at the audacity of the Chinese government. Okay, they are communists, they are atheists, they say religion is poison, yet they're saying, we will decide who selects the Dalai Lama, but not the Dalai Lama himself, So, it's like, in a way, it's very crazy kind of a logic, but they have the audacity to sell that. So from our point of view, this is a strictly spiritual matter. It is for His Holiness Dalai Lama to decide, and no one can interfere, not the Chinese government, not the European government, not the Indian government, not American government, because this is a purely spiritual matter. So that's our, stance. And
yet, the Panchen Lama was actually chosen by China. He was just a child at the time. The boy who had been identified disappeared, and we still don't know his whereabouts.
So I think this technical issue is the search committee by Panchen Lama's monastery, Tash Lumpo, recognized by the Chinese government, chose or selected Gendun Chögyal Nyima as the Panchen Lama. And His Holiness Dalai Lama endorsed him as the Panchen Lama. So as per the spiritual procedure, he is the Panchen Lama. But now Chinese government kidnapped him, and he has disappeared almost for 30 years. In his place, Chinese government imposed a fake Panchen Lama, you see. So we must differentiate between the original one and the fake one. And the fake is always fake. That product is never good,
But are you not worried that the same thing might happen again?
They will do this. Of course, they will do the same thing. But then fake is fake. Fake is fake, one. And spirituality is a matter of heart and mind. You can't force anyone to follow this leader or that religion, unless you wholly, internally, that's why it's called devotion. It has to come from within. So when they impose a fake one, we will say that's a fake one, So our one, the one His Holiness Dalai Lama decides, will be the original one, the main one. We're going back for 800 years of procedure and practices, and that will be the real Dalai Lama.
And so for future generations, post the 14th Dalai Lama, you see still a strong future which is based on the spiritual practice of Tibetan Buddhism?
Yes, because one, we are Tibetan, we're the mountain people, we are very rugged, we live above 4,000 meters high. Number two, we are Buddhists. Buddhism is 2,500 plus years old, it has gone through its phases, but it survived. And communism is 100 plus years old, right? Comparatively, philosophically speaking, they're baby, so we will withstand and, survive way past the days of communism in China.
On that positive note, we'll end the show. Lobsang Sangay and Wenqi Xu, thank you so much for joining us on Taiwan Talks. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching.